Hi, and welcome to My Words, Our Journey, Season 2, Episode 8. I'm your host, Monty, and today we begin with Chapter 38. Meagan read her local paper and watched the 24-hour cable news cycle so she could stay on top of the situation. What she had seen over the past few days was not encouraging. Their small town had drawn way too much attention. The husband shootings, the FBI agent shooting, and the murder of a young man in front of his own grandmother just over the county line. Could she risk one more job for Madison? The answer she kept coming back to? Yes. Meagan needed this more than the others. Stuart had become increasingly violent. She and the children never knew what might set him off. She had thought it was work related until a few weeks earlier when she had read the text on his so called work phone. It was from one of his three secretaries. She had broken off their relationship right about the same time his demeanor took a turn from bad to ugly. The text message did not surprise her, or bother her really. There was a time she would have fought for her man, but that time had come and gone. Their story was not that unusual from the beginning to about the middle of their tale. She had met Stuart while waiting tables on the weekends to help pay for her college. He had swept her off her feet, moved her into his studio apartment, and helped her with bills. In return, she became the good wife, even before they were married. Their transition from girlfriend to housemaid had been so subtle, Meagan had not noticed until it was too late. There were the children to consider, and while Stuart grew more and more distant and more demanding, he was not violent and did not flaunt his infidelities. Now Meagan could call those the good old days. After pouring her third bourbon and Diet Coke, she let her body fall into the oversized recliner, not noticing the splash of drink that fell onto her V-neck sweater. She was way too concerned with the pain in her left shoulder and lower back to worry about a spill. Yesterday had been one of the worst days in recent memory. Stuart had planned a cocktail party at the house to impress a potential client for his contracting business. He had told her and the children time and time again over the past week just how important this piece of business was to his firm, over and over and over again. His family had made sure everything was in order when he arrived home from work. Unfortunately, they could not control the guests. Stuart's cell phone rang shortly before 6 p.m., and shortly after, he was in a rage. Meagan could not get the children off to their rooms before their father cursed them and threw two bottles of unopened beer at their heads, something he had never done before. Meagan made Rodney promise he and his sisters would stay in his room with the door locked until she came back to get them. She promised in return that everything would be fine. Daddy had just had some really bad news, and he loved them. It would never hurt any of them. But as she left, hearing the door lock behind her, she wondered if any of that had been true. He was livid when she returned to the kitchen. She had to return, or he would have come looking for them. Now she would get the bulk of his wrath, and she did. Stuart had touched her before, but it was always a slap, a shake, or a push. Never had he used her as his personal punching bag until last night. With her children upstairs, her husband swung wildly, kicked crazily, and swore without remorse until he lost his strength or his interest, or both. She still wasn't sure. While she lay on the cool, hard floor, trying to regain some sort of composure, he took a six-pack to the living room, sat on the couch, and watched a baseball game she could hear plain as day all the way in the kitchen, through ears that rang from pain, mental and physical. When she felt she could, Meagan made her way to her son's room. They let her in, and the four of them curled up on his bed, snuggled tight, and cried themselves to sleep. None had woken until they heard the slamming of the front door the next morning, followed by the starting of his truck and the squawking of the tires as he headed down the normally quiet side street. As Meagan sucked on an ice cube, she thought about how she would stand next to Stuart without remorse as Madison shot him dead. Heaven help her, but the thought made her feel good, almost forgetting her pain. His violence was not bad enough, but as he had dished out his attack last evening, he had screamed at her, revealing their financial woes. From what she could remember, he had told her with the potential new client they were in trouble. Without him and his strip mall project, they were in ruin. Ruined, she thought. So as thankful as she was that her and the children were safe for now, she was equally upset at how Stuart had cheated on her, degraded her, and now beaten and financially crippled them. For his sins, he would die at her hand. Madison watched as her nieces shoveled tricks in by the handful. They were maybe 100 pounds between them, but working over the family-sized box of sugar-coated goodness like their lives depended on it. With not a care in the world, she imagined. Their parents had needed to run a few errands this morning, and Madison was pleased to have the distraction. It had been a surprise when she had read that Meagan wanted to let the game play out. It was more of a surprise when she realized she would be taking the last life only 2 blocks from the police station, outside of a church where Meagan and her family were members and rarely missed a Sunday morning or Wednesday evening service. This, however, would be a night none would forget. While Madison and Meagan waited, Leonard and Kenny tried to stay busy. There was little for either to do, however. Both wanted to be back to their normal lives, but knew there was no chance of that until there was some sort of closure. Kenny had suggested the pair go off and review the articles that had appeared in the newspaper over the course of several weeks, hoping to see the connection that led Sean to his fate. Leonard had nothing better to do, so he agreed. After gathering information from the overly helpful gal at the library, they headed to the hotel, where they were gained access to one of the 3 small meeting rooms the hotel manager said they could use as long as they liked. It was a far cry from the big city, Leonard had noticed, but, as he had learned long ago, bad things happen everywhere, even in small towns. Kenny had read a few of the articles out loud. "It is not every day that you get a serial killer in a town like this," he said. "It was what motivated him to come here, I agree. But how did he end up in the alleyway with the murderer? What did he see? Or was he lured there?" Leonard stood and walked around the conference table, scratching the 2-day growth of his chin. "We are just spinning our wheels until we can talk to Sean. Until then, we're only guessing." And with that, Kenny folded the papers, put them neatly in the center of the table, and grabbed his coat. "Let's go for dinner." Chapter 39. After a lengthy meal, the 2 friends parted ways. While neither would admit it, each needed time alone. Kenny went back to his room, changed into running gear, grabbed his iPod, and headed out to the trail adjacent to the hotel parking lot. Leonard took a different approach. Even before Leonard said goodbye to Kenny, he had already decided on stopping somewhere for an early nightcap. Something deep inside resisted inviting Kenny for whatever reason. After a little thought, he decided to venture away from the hotel lounge. He wanted to mingle more with the locals and less with the business travelers, if there was any business going on in this small town. He found himself at an establishment without a name. Calling it a dive would have been an overstatement, but it seemed to have a steady flow of locals streaming in and out of the double front doors. Leonard had wet his whistle at worse places over the years, he thought. Once inside, he immediately noticed 3 things. The locals loved the place. They liked to start partying early, and there was still no visible way for him to know the name of this popular watering hole. He did, however, find that the booths, picnic tables, and dance floor were much more popular than the bar stools that surrounded a bar that looked like the weight of a cocktail olive may cause it to collapse. After ordering and receiving his cold beer, Leonard turned on his stool to face the ever-growing crowd. To the owner's credit, the place was well stocked with bouncers, and they appeared to be ready to do their jobs. A few moments into a slow song, Leonard noticed a commotion on the floor. It appeared a young man had gotten a little too grabby with a young woman, and now he stood embarrassed on the dance floor, surrounded by his friends, while the female was making her way to the bar stool to Leonard's left. On a scale of 1 to 10, Leonard quickly gave her an 8+. It was one of his few talents. The thought made him smile. When she took the stool, ordered her beer, lit a cigarette, turned to Leonard, and said without apology, "Don't even think about it, mister. I'm in no mood for chit-chat tonight." He moved her up to a 9 and did not acknowledge her existence. He was finishing his drink and had already laid the cash to cover his small tab on the bar when he heard the group coming up behind him. Before he could turn, Leonard heard the young punk from the dance floor yelling at the woman next to him. The stud had obviously decided he could not let this gal ruin his rep with his crew. He was verbally abusive, but she seemed to be handling her own when it came to comebacks, so Leonard just enjoyed how she stood up for herself, but somehow still acted like a lady. Not a lady you'd necessarily find in church on Sunday, but a lady Leonard could spend some time with, nonetheless. He was figuring the pair had reached their end and about to finish up when he heard the slap. Smiling, he guessed the young man had pushed her just a little too far, but when the gal's head fell next to the bar, next to his empty glass, the smile went from his face. Leonard did not like a lot of things. A man that hit a woman was somewhere at the top of that list. "Can I think about it now, miss?" And with that, Leonard turned and took the surprised 20-something and pulled him close. Took his right forearm, twisted, and yanked it behind his back, applying just the right amount of pressure. "Do you have something to say to the nice lady, mister?" Silence, followed by more pressure. "Anything?" "I am sorry I ever laid eyes on you, you piece of—" Before he could finish his catchy phrase, Leonard whirled him around and tossed him towards his friends. "Get him out of here, unless he wants more of this old man." With a nod, his bartender placed a fresh one where his last one is set. So Leonard did the only thing he needed to do. He sat back down. Without looking, he could tell the woman was still sitting next to him, trying to regain her composure, and finally she spoke. "I'm sorry about all this. I've just got a lot going on, and I just wanted to unwind a little before I have to go take care of some business." 3 bouncers walked in close behind Leonard. He figured they had waited because they were either with the friends of the creep or just wanted to watch the show. Before he or they could say anything, the bartender told them he was cool, and they disappeared back into the crowd. Madison did not look over at the old man after she had asked for his forgiveness. She was not even sure if he had responded. All men, were on her list at the moment, and had been for a while. Chapter 40. After a little episode at the bar, Madison went and sat in her car. Just sitting. No music, no deep thoughts, just sitting, letting her body and mind recover from the overwhelming stress. There seemed to be trouble everywhere she turned. Knowing being alone with her thoughts would solve nothing, she finally started the car. That was when she saw him exiting the bar. Why not, she thought, as she shoved the car back into park, jumped from her seat, and walked briskly towards the man. After a brief conversation, Madison was on her way to her last killing. The thought, depressing, but made her smile a little. She wanted this to be over more than anything. She wondered as she drove the short distance, how would this affect her mental health in the long term? The parking lot was full of small sedans and minivans. Was this normal? Did this many people really go to church on a Wednesday night? Madison was surprised by the number of vehicles and also Megan's choice. Her directions had told her to park in the lot across the street from the church, in the last row that backed up to the tree line. There were only 5 cars besides hers, one being a shiny GMC truck with the vanity plate that read STU1, and that also rested in the last row. Madison now waited and hoped that this last murder would go as planned, and she could be home and in bed sooner rather than later. As she listened to someone singing about better days on one of the 7 local country stations, she pondered her life, the choices made, and regrets she lived with. Madison had found this to be an everyday occurrence lately. She also wondered how such a horrible husband and father could be so devoted to his church 2 or 3 times a week. Meagan was pondering too. Her thoughts were not on the past, however. They were on the present and immediate future. With a heart rate that she felt was certainly in a danger zone, whatever that may be, she could not turn her mind off or even slow it down. Would this work? Was she soon to be a widow? What if Madison was caught? What if she hadn't shown up? If she was caught, would she tell her secrets? What kind of man would she end up with next? Would she find someone that loved her and the children? How would she handle Stuart's funeral arrangements? As she sat in church with her family, she also wondered if the Lord would forgive her eventually. She was a believer in God, and she knew the murder was a sin. Meagan, however, had convinced herself that the Lord wanted his children to be happy and safe. And until her husband was gone, neither of these seemingly simple things would be possible for her or her kids. It was not until her children hugged her tight and said they would see her soon that she realized the service was over and they were heading towards the back door. She had literally been in her own little world. The children were going home with some friends from church for a sleepover. Megan had asked if it would be okay 1 week earlier, just in case. As she lingered by the front door watching the cars drive away, she glanced to see how many cars were left in the far lot. 2. Typically, Megan and her family were the last to leave each Sunday and Wednesday after the service. Megan made sure all the lights were turned off, checked each row for lost or forgotten items, while Stuart checked each door to make sure they were locked and the air was turned down until the next service. It really wasn't their job, but rather a small part they had just fallen into over the years. Madison had not waited long before bodies started to flood through the church doors. It was a steady stream through the front and side door for several minutes until it slowed to a trickle, and both parking lots emptied just as quickly. Families were heading home to get their children to bed, she thought. Now there were only 2 cars in the parking lot she was in, and one in the lot across the way, as she held her breath and clung to the weapon she would use to take another life. The last light went out inside the church just as the last car in the closer lot turned on its headlights and backed out. 2 dark figures began to head in her direction, not close together, but not too far apart either, just walking to their car, one clueless, the other determined. Madison just had enough time to slip from her seat, slide across the back of her car, and take a position on the driver's rear corner panel, kneeling so not to be seen. She was sweating, though it was chilly, fearing this may be a mistake that cost them their freedom. As the couple approached, she waited until Megan was on her side of the vehicle before she stood with the gun in hand, aimed and ready. The small amount of light was just enough for Stuart to see the figure and the weapon, though there was no way he could know who this person was, even if he could see them plainly. Before he could take a step, either forward or back, Madison fired a shot that rang out into the night. She had aimed for his heart, but instead had hit Stuart in the right shoulder, giving him time to open the car door and half fall into the SUV. Madison took only 2 steps until she was directly behind her victim, and without thought or remorse, she pumped 2 more rounds into his back, then stood and watched the blood quickly exit the wounds and cover the tan jacket he wore. He was dead. Megan had watched in horror, as if watching a movie on the television set, not really letting her mind compute what she was seeing. It was not until she felt the cold on her ears that she finally looked away from the one she used to love. A thought occurred to her, one she had not thought of until this very moment, one she felt was right somehow. "Quick, shoot me in the shoulder as I turn to run, then get out of here and wait." As Megan gave her demand, she turned away from Madison and spoke again. "I love you, Madison. We all do." With that, she began to trot away, waiting for something to happen. Madison was stunned by the request. Wanting, needing to get away, there was no time to protest, so with tears in her eyes, she aimed and fired 1 shot. A shot she knew instantly hit its mark because Megan jerked forward and then fell hard to the ground, face first. And with that last scene forever imprinted on her brain, Madison went into survival mode. Chapter 41. Megan could answer many of the questions she had been asked by the police over the last several days. One, however, she had asked herself, would never be answered. Had she felt or heard the shot first? It was so not important after everything that had happened. Still, her medicated mind kept returning to the same question. Megan wondered if it was her way of keeping thoughts away from deeper issues. The authorities' inquiries had been easy because she had rehearsed them so many times. She felt sure she had given them exactly what she wanted them to have, even with all the trauma and medications. Madison's shot had hit her square in the shoulder blade, which was painful enough, but the force had thrown her flat on her face, causing all sorts of damage to her cheekbone, nose, and even left eye. She had not seen a mirror, and for that, Megan was thankful. The news had been broken to her by her pastor's wife. Her husband was killed by the assailant. Her children were safe and dealing the best they could, and the church was praying for all of them. It had been words she so wanted to hear, and still words that made her sad. There were bouts of tears she could not control, guilt or meds, she wasn't sure, but they drained her. Those, along with the unannounced visits by the police, kept her weak, even though she had never slept so much in all her life. While Megan rested, there were 2 men waiting to question her, waiting until the local authority gave them permission, waiting for now, but not much longer. Kenny and Leonard were trying to play by the rules of the local authorities, even though it was killing them inside. The wives in the previous cases were not open to talking to the detectives, let alone two from the big city. The local authorities, and Kenny and Leonard had reluctantly agreed to leave the grieving wives alone. They had read all the reports along with other articles related to the incidents. They wanted more than anything to speak to a witness, live and in person. Here was their chance, and again they were waiting in the same waiting room they had been waiting to see a friend. A friend, by the way, that was still in a coma according to the latest report from Jill. Leonard was there in spirit, and he really did want to get in front of this woman. He did have other things on his mind as well, however. Leonard had made a date for tonight. Actually, he had made the date only a few hours before the woman they were waiting to see lost her husband and father of her children. He had not told Kenny, for many different reasons, and he decided if they were still waiting in an hour, he would fake not feeling well and head out. But if they got their shot, he would just bail on the date and be okay with that. The date was crazy anyhow. He was much too old, and she was way too young. He was much too plain, and she was way too pretty. There was no happy ending to this tale, Leonard figured, as he looked at the 3-month-old Sports Illustrated for the umpteenth time. While the boys waited impatiently, Jill continued to speak to her man. It was all she knew to do. Emotionally, as it was, she had no choice, for she had decided if she had to sit and wait and sit, without doing something, she would have been moved up to the 2 floors higher, to the mental ward. Sean and her faith were strong. She felt he would be back to his old self someday. She also felt it would not be an easy recovery. The doctors had tried to explain to her just how the bullet had entered and bounced around a little before lodging. It was not that she didn't care, it was just that it was all too much for her. The only thing Jill wanted to know was when would Sean be his old self. Jill had heard about the recent murder and the woman close by recovering from a gunshot wound. She wished nothing bad on anyone. However, she was relieved that Kenny and Leonard had something else to occupy their time. They were 2 special men in their own way, but they were also not used to handling a woman they weren't trying to hit on. It took her back to the early days of their courtship. Sean had grown up with sisters and a mom he adored, so he knew how to be around women. There was a difference in how he interacted and how other boys tried. It was just another way that Sean set himself above and beyond the others. With her mind on the past, Jill almost missed the present. Sean's hand was moving. No, not just moving. His hand was gliding across the top of her hand. In a small circle, his fingers worked. Jill knew she should jump up and go to get someone. Instead, she savored the moment until she saw his eyes open and struggled to focus. Sean, take it slow, his wife whispered. Chapter 42. She was as lovely as he remembered. He had tried to prepare himself for a letdown. The lighting the other night was poor. He had been drinking, and his mind was mush as of late. But Leonard watched as she crossed the room. He watched her, and the men that followed her with their eyes as well. He was not let down. They had decided to meet for dinner and drinks at a popular fish house in town. Both had thought about not showing up for the endeavor, but, however, both ended up needing the diversion. Madison had completed her mission the night prior and had been looking forward to this opportunity to get out and relax, even just for an hour or two. She did not know how long it would take for the team of ladies to feel comfortable enough to meet again, but she did know it would be a while. The news had covered last night's murder nonstop. From channel to channel, you could catch one part of the story or another. From how the latest murders affected local businesses to how much the coworkers will miss good old Stu. The individual stories bothered her to a small degree. It was the occasional in-depth investigation report that really got to her emotionally. They would show photos of all the men, go through their deaths detail by detail, and for whatever reason, she could not turn away. The interviews with family, friends, and coworkers were hard to take. All the crying and the talk of how good the men were. It was way too much. A distraction was just what the doctor ordered. Leonard was not what Madison normally was attracted to. He was older, a little thicker in the middle, and a little whiter on top. Still, she was looking forward to a nice dinner and hopefully pleasant conversation. She had asked him to meet her, not the other way around. It felt good to take charge of the situation. When Leonard had taken up for her, paid his tab, and left, Madison had still been sitting in her car. The old Madison would never have considered such a move. The new Madison had not thought twice. Leonard had seemed awkwardly surprised and somehow reluctant to say yes. He had in the end, however, and now Madison could see him sitting at a table for two in the far corner of the crowded family-style restaurant. His smile was truthful, and Madison knew inside he was an honest man whom she did not have to worry about. Maybe that was why she had chased after him. Maybe Madison wanted someone she could be happy but also safe with. "You look lovely, Madison," Leonard spoke softly as she reached the table. For a second, Madison was not sure what Leonard was doing when he moved around the table and pulled out the chair. She knew she was blushing and ready to giggle, but she did not care. That was what her mom would call a gentleman. "Thank you, Leonard. You look nice too. I hope you haven't been waiting long." Madison felt a little schoolgirlish on her first date, not a murdering vixen that just finished a killing spree. This had been a good idea, she thought. As the waitress moved in, filled water glasses, and began telling them of tonight's specials, the two settled in. Neither knew it yet, but they would sit way past closing, talking about movies, books, school, big cities, small towns, love, life, music, likes, dislikes, and beliefs. It was not until they were finished with their last bottle of wine that Madison finally thought to ask Leonard what he did for a living. The answer caused her throat to close, as if a grown man with a heavy work boot was standing on her windpipe. "Detective?" She listened as he went on to explain why he was in town and about his friend in the hospital. Now it was an elephant on top of her, and it was sitting on Madison's entire body. Why had she not asked sooner? Madison did not know the answer. They had just clicked right away, right from the beginning, and she had not even thought about it until too late. A detective in town to help a fallen friend. Perfect. The next day, Kenny, Leonard, and Sean spoke, with the first few moments being strained. Leonard and Kenny could not blame Sean. After some small talk, the discussion turned to the events that led to where they were in this particular morning. The pair sat and listened as Sean took them from reading the first article regarding the town and the death of the novelist all the way to where they were, to this moment. From the beginning until he opened the door to the alley, all the details had been clear and complete. Unfortunately, the area most concerned was also the area where Sean went fuzzy. The last thing he could remember was opening the door where he could barely see. He thought he had heard voices, but couldn't remember if they were male or female. He could not remember the victim or the wife, or what happened seconds before he was shot. Sean knew the Tantum would be disappointed because he was as well. "What do you want us to do?" Kenny asked. "I've been thinking about something, boys," Sean said. "I think that'll be a good place to stop for today. I hope you've enjoyed today's episode, and thank you so much for listening. I hope you'll join me next episode. Have a great day."